Good afternoon, Dr. Wu, and good morning to Dr. Littler. I'm Ching, a third-year law student at the Faculty of Law, University Malaya. Together with me is my coursmate, Rebecca. Thank you very much for kindly agreeing to spend time with us to clarify some queries that we have relating to the topic of ethics in research on health and climate change. We seek clarification so as to enhance our background understanding when we conduct our research on the GFBR and C Bioethics Network essay competition. All right, I'll first pose the question to Dr. Littler. Doctor, what is the relationship between health and climate change?
Great, thank you. And it's a pleasure to be here with my colleague, Tech Chuan. So it's a big question. I'm going to try consolidate it to a reasonably succinct answer. So I think it's reasonable to say that climate change is having and will continue to have serious implications for human physical and mental health and well-being. At the WHO, we have said that climate change is the most important threat to human health. So it really is a huge crisis that needs to be dealt with an enormous sense of urgency as well. So health threats include both direct health impacts, and I'll give a couple examples of those in a minute, and also indirect threats, and I'll give a couple examples of that. And they're both changing disease vectors and displacement of people. So they're having huge impact on the way that we live. And given the volume of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere and the current trajectory of global greenhouse gases emissions, these threats will continue to intensify. So it's an exacerbated problem. And I said I'd give a couple of examples of direct health impacts. So extreme heat, which is driving a range of health effects associated with challenges to body temperature regulation, heat stroke, heat exhaustion, hypothermia, for example. Extreme heat also exacerbates current conditions such as cardiovascular disease, respiratory diseases, and diabetes-related conditions. The other one you can look at, one of the other examples as a direct health impact would be extreme climate events, flooding, which we've seen recently in many different settings, including the huge floods in Pakistan, and wildfires, which we are seeing in many places across the globe. Examples of indirect health impacts. So food and water stability is increasingly threatened by climate change, particularly through the excess heat that I mentioned earlier and associated droughts. Falling crop yields, salination of fresh water supplies is a big problem. You can look at rising sea levels, which is directly related to the salination of fresh water, loss of agricultural land through extremes of daytime heat that have significant health impacts, including through malnutrition and shortage of local and traditional foodstuffs relating to reliance on imported foods. Mental health and well-being is another indirect health impact, although I think you could see direct ones as well, that's being increasingly associated with climate change. So you've got eco-anxiety, the loss of associated with climate change, driven changes to our home environments, are emergent forms of distress associated with climate change, particularly amongst younger generations, but not just younger generations, I think it's important to say. And then huge issues of human displacement and migration. And these are increasingly being driven by climate change. And the health effects of forced migration include mental and physical effects of the disruption of traditional livelihoods, potentially devastating health impacts of migrating, including exposure to violence, loss of access to health and other services, increased exposure to infectious diseases and other health threats during migration. And that's my answer to question number one.
Thank you, Dr. Littler. Would Dr. Wu like to add further views on this, or shall we move on to the next question?
Yeah, I think there's so many threats, right? And for the purpose of the essay, I think it will be more engaging and be helpful to focus on threats that are immediate to the region. I think we're all experiencing the effects of heat nowadays. So these are all kind of issues that maybe people interested in essay competition could focus on.
Okay, so our next question to Dr. Wu is, are the consequences of climate change more severely felt in developing countries such as Malaysia as compared to developed countries?
Yeah, I think there's ample evidence from a lot of research showing that the worst off countries affected by climate change are countries that are developing and with the poorest resources. So if you look at the countries involved, right, there will be typically countries which are already badly affected by other things like earthquakes, war, for example, right? So countries like Somalia, Afghanistan, and so forth. So climate change kind of compounds all the suffering of the people living in these countries. I think the important question, besides looking at the consequences, is looking at the ethical implications of these consequences. So if certain countries are worse off or well, more badly hit by climate change, the question is then how should research then be geared towards addressing the issues? So one thing you can consider is, for example, how research should be prioritized, in order to address the differing effects, what kind of concepts would guide the prioritization of research, for example. Is it just about maximizing benefits or reducing harm or trying to improve health equity, right? So these are things that you can think about when you think about the consequences. And again, as I stress, it's hard sometimes to understand what's happening in different parts of the world, right? And looking at what is important for the region might be a helpful way to think through these questions.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Wu. Dr. Dittler, would you like to add further views regarding this question?
I think that was covered really well. I guess it is, we know climate change is a global phenomenon and it's being felt everywhere in the world, but it is affecting the world. It's not affecting the world equally. We also understand that some regions, countries, and communities are far more seriously and immediately affected than others. And I think if you're writing an essay from a Malaysian perspective, it would be really interesting to understand how is it affecting peoples, and I'm deliberately saying, and different populations within Malaysia differently. And the critical question is, how should we respond in our research to that? So I think Teck Chuan's point about priority setting as a question and what that needs to look like in different countries and regions, and the relationship between different populations in country and region is really important.
Yeah, the idea of the peoples, I think, is very important. So you want to look at it within a global health perspective, right? You know that even in high-income countries or middle-income countries, there are populations that are actually a lot worse off than compared to other populations within that specific country, right? Let's say you think about the refugees in, let's say, Malaysia, for example. So how does climate change affect them, right? So the other thing to think about is, okay, so if you are trying to think about and trying to set the research agenda for research, right, and thinking it from it through an ethics lens, then one way to think about it is to break it down into procedures and substantive concerns. So procedures is, what sort of a process should guide the entire deliberation on what research should be prioritized. So you think about, who should I engage, who should be involved, who should I hear from, who should have the power to decide, and things like that, right? So that's the process aspect of that. The substantive aspect will be those ethical principles and considerations I mentioned earlier, things like equity, maximizing benefit, helping the worst off, for example, fairness, social justice. These are all the substantive concepts that will guide the prioritization of research. So that's the one way you can think about breaking down, thinking through the ethical implications of the consequences of climate change.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Wu and Dr. Dittler. We will now move on to our third question. How do the activities that are carried out when researching into health and climate change impact on the world's climate?
Another great question, another huge question. So I think research is increasingly a large, complex, multi-institutional, multi-country, multi-regional, it's international in scope, undertaking with its own environmental impacts, which I think we need to acknowledge. So for example, you look at the big data revolution, which is critical to us collecting information about the impacts of climate change on health, right? But the electricity that's required to store large volumes of research data is huge. The precious metals that are required for computers and other types of research equipment, and even the travel that researchers take during the course of research, all have an impact on climate change itself. So interestingly, I think that the main focus of this year's, and we've got to remember that in writing the essay, the main focus of this year's Global Forum on Bioethics on Research is on the ethics of conducting research on the health impacts of climate change. We also need to recognize the ethical obligations to reduce and/or mitigate the impacts of research itself on climate change. So there are two distinct strands here, and I'm going to talk in one of the further questions about some of what I think are the substantive ethical issues that we need to look at. But I do think this is a really interesting question about our responsibility as a research community to understand our impact on climate and health and the environment. And it's not the key focus of the GFBR, but it's a very important question related to it. And actually, out of interest, our unit, the Health Ethics and Governance Unit at the WHO headquarters, actually has a call for proposals out at the moment, which is relevant to this work. So maybe of interest for some of the people putting in an application for the essay. But I'm sure TC's got something else to add on this one as well.
I think covered it quite well, actually.
Thank you for the answer. And just one sub question under this. May we know that what are the activities that are typically carried out by researchers when researching into health and climate change?
Well, I can take a crack at that. I think, of course, there's obviously collecting the relevant data, right? And that can be through observations of certain metrics that they're looking at. The differences in extreme temperatures, for example, is one thing they can track and monitor. So that's one form of research. The other one would be doing actual things on clinical trials. So in Singapore, for example, they're looking at heat technology. So I'm just focusing on heat because that's the thing I'm most concerned about nowadays. And then they're sort of tracking and doing randomized control trials on the effectiveness of these heat technologies, right? So that's another thing. And of course, if these are proven effective in our setting, Singapore, then the question is whether or not this technology can be used readily in other settings. So if they actually require quite a lot of technological setup, for example, or they require things that can't be done in other countries, then what other form of research can support the transfer of that technology to other settings? So these are various kind of research activities that are being done. Yeah.
And I'll add, I mean, there's so many, the breadth is, and it's such an emerging field, I think. You could add, there's a lot now of surveillance activities to understand the impact on different populations. So I know in some really interesting work going on in sub-Saharan Africa, where they're looking at the impact of heat with pregnant women, for example. What does 1 to 2 degree temperature rise mean for that population in terms of their health and the outcomes of the babies born as a consequence? So, you're starting to look at subsections of population surveillance work, trial design is being impacted. So it's a huge field. And I think what's also critically important is it's a cross-discipline field. And I've deliberately used the word cross-discipline and not inter, because I think climate change and health brings together really needs a multidisciplinary approach. You need epidemiologists, environmental scientists, you need doctors, you need really big cross-section of thinking. So it's making us, I think, rethink some of our research processes. And that's one of the critical things I think we're interested in this GFBR meeting is how is it impacting and changing the way that we do research?
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Wu and Dr. Littler. So the next question is, why are ethics relevant when conducting research into health and climate change?
So I'll take that one. I think we've answered quite a lot, but I'll just add on a little bit. I think you can take it in 2 ways. One is you look at a more macro perspective. So when you're doing research, what kind of ethical principles should guide, let's say, the prioritization as well as the actual conducting of the research itself, right? So you can look at it in terms of the frameworks, for example. So you look at typical research ethics frameworks, they focus on things like ensuring informed consent, data privacy, ensuring that the benefits and burdens of the research are equitably or fairly distributed and so forth. But not many people or rather institutions are looking at taking account environmental sustainability considerations in the research itself. So when you're doing research, for example, do you need to look for more energy efficient resources that you're using when you're conducting your research? So for example, you're doing AI research, what kind of less data intensive mechanisms are you relying, data centers that are actually more efficient, right? So you're not contributing to the carbon emissions and so forth. So one question you ask yourself is, are current research ethics frameworks sufficient for climate change? And then the other kind of question is, what sort of ethical considerations should guide when we're conducting climate change research itself? So these are the kind of prioritization of research that you can think about. And what sort of processes do you need to incorporate, for example? So, one way in which research can be conducted is very kind of helicopter kind of research. You just go to another country. For example, you're from a rich nation, you go to another country and you think about kind of solutions. Increasingly, that kind of method is regarded as not so good because the outcomes itself, the technologies developed, for example, may not be suitable for the people to take out. So there's a lot of emphasis now on community engagement, right? So how can community engagement, hearing from the voices of people who are affected by climate change, for example, help with climate change research? So these are a number of ways you can think about the question.
All right. Thank you for the clarification, Dr. Wu. Dr. Littler, could you share your perspective on this?
I think Dr. Vu's covered it really well, and we've covered in the earlier questions. And I'll come to it, I think, in my answer to question 6 and 7. But yeah, it raises a lot of issues in relation. The ethical issues are related to global justice, collective action issues, intragenerational issues. So, and increasingly, and we'll cover this in the next question, the value of the non-human world, which is quite different to our perspective in the way that we currently think about doing research most of the time.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Littler. So our next question is, how do the ethical questions in research into health and climate change differ from other types of research?
Great. Well, first, let me caveat by saying, I think this is a work in progress. Like, this is what we are learning at the moment and trying to explore. How does it fundamentally alter? I mean, I think the differences are, and this isn't unique. I mean, a lot of research is complex. It's interlinked, it's multifactorial, but it does give rise to substantive ethical questions that extend beyond the traditional spheres of research ethics. And I alluded to that before when I gave additional insights into the last question. I mean, it does include global justice questions, collective action questions, issues of how we conduct research to include the non-human. So for me, one of the really interesting questions at the moment is in relation to human subject research. Social value is entirely a concept that's framed around humans, right? But when you're thinking about climate change and health, I think that concept of social value needs to be rethought to think about the value of the non-human world. It's not, the environment and animals aren't just an instrument for our actions. They have a value in their own right. So I think we have to rethink some fundamental core concepts in the way that we do research. Other issues, I think, so again, I said the moral value of the human world really needs to be rethought. We have an absolute dependence on the Earth's ecosystem, which I don't think we've acknowledged as well in past research. I don't think we can separate our health and well-being from the environment we live and draw our sustenance from. This raises profound questions about the moral value of the human world and how we center that in our work going forward. So important questions for research, and you may want to think about the nature and strength of our obligations to respect and protect non-humans, animals, landscape, or nature. So how can we factor that into our research going forward and sometimes maybe take a less human-centric view? I mentioned issues of intra and intergenerational justice. So carbon dioxide, the most prominent of the global health gases, endures in the atmosphere for centuries, even millennia. This time lag between the emission of these global health gases and their impacts gives rise to what we call temporal ethical issues. So these include the obligations to both younger generations, and that's easier to understand, the rights of, but future generations. So what do those rights look like when you're talking about a generation that hasn't even been born yet? And how do we factor those into decision making and the way that we do research? Really interesting, really complex issues. Scientific uncertainty. I think this is not unique. This came out in COVID-19, but I think maybe it's magnified in climate change work. So I think climate change is characterized by specific kinds of scientific uncertainty. The complexity of the world's climate and the possibility for what we're calling threshold events, so sudden irreversible shifts in climate change, invite questions about the reliability of climate modeling. Modeling is a big thing in this field, and our ethical obligations in the face of potential catastrophic outcomes. There's a real urgency, I think, that is coming more and more to the fore with the way that we need to do our research in this space. So the scale of the uncertainty and the nature of the risks involved, I would argue, increase our moral obligations to identify areas of work of research, including at the global level, regional level, and country level, likely to have significant practical implications. And there's a real obligation to address the most pressing problems. And I guess the question for the essay students is, what are the most pressing problems in your setting? I've already mentioned urgency. I think this is a real key fact here. We got a sense of urgency in pandemics. So why isn't climate change an emergency like a pandemic? I think there's a really interesting question to ask ourselves about that. I've said issues around global justice. So given the health impacts of climate change fall heaviest in resource poor settings, although within subsets of populations, as Techuan said before, even in high income settings, some populations are much more affected by climate change, and that often has an economic, but not always, a value associated with it. So, there's an ethical obligation to identify these populations or identify these settings and tackle the structural impediments to research undertaken by researchers. So I guess there's a question, should we be focusing our research on the people most affected by climate change, both within countries but across countries? And that goes to the question of priority setting, and also how do we take account of local and Indigenous voices in the way that we do research or the way that we respond to climate change. I could keep going on, but I wanted to add one about research governance as my final point. As I said, I think research ethics paradigms will have to shift. I've already mentioned, I think social benefit as a concept needs to change, but I think climate change also affects our individualized, our very autonomy-focused attitude towards research. So that really raises the questions about how we judge the social value and about how we focus. Maybe we should be focusing more on communities and less on the individuals. And I wonder if that will have an effect on informed consent models going forward. But I'll stop there.
Okay, I believe Dr. Wu has something to add on.
Yeah, I think what Karen just said kind of got me thinking about, so there's all this challenging about the worldview, right, that is guiding your research. So if you take a very human-centered, anthropocentric research, you might tend to ask certain questions that is from a very human-centered perspective. So if you were to ask questions of, taking account the interests of animals and the environment, not equally as humans perhaps, but, given a significant moral attention, maybe that will sort of reshape the kind of questions that you're asking. So this leads to actually, when it comes to the relevant ethics to research ethics, sometimes you also actually need some research into ethics itself, right? And not just focusing on how ethics can guide research into scientific questions. So interrogating how we relate to the environment, to animals, for example, is another way you can sort of incorporate ethics into the whole kind of knowledge production that in some ways can also help to sort of reshape the research agenda. Think about the kind of questions they are kind of asking.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Likia and Dr. Wu. Our next question concerns the role of existing ethics. So how are existing ethics on research or international agreements, if there's any, relevant to research into health and climate change?
Yeah, so I think I'll take that one. So I think there are at least two ways. So one way is through the funders route, right? Funders might have certain requirements on ensuring that your research itself complies with certain environmental sustainable standards. So Wellcome, for example, which incidentally funds the Global Forum on Bioethics in Research, actually has certain sort of requirements on, say, the kind of materials and equipment you purchased, right? So they should also sort of comply with environmental saving standards. Another way is through broader international documents. So if you look at the Ethics, Climate Change and Health paper that we circulated, there was a mention of some international documents, and one is from UNESCO, right? So they talk about things like ensuring independence of life and on Earth, global justice, precautionary principle, duty to share scientific knowledge, integrity of scientific research, and so forth. So all these things are kind of guiding principles or values. Okay, so let's just look at integrity of scientific research. That is like a core value for any sort of research, right? You don't try to manipulate your data, you don't falsify your data and so forth, right? But in terms of the ethics of climate change, we know that there are very strong views, right? For very long on whether or not climate change is even real. So we change from global warming to climate change and so forth. And so if you take integrity seriously, what does that require of you as a researcher? Right? Do you then not work with funders who have certain agenda, maybe even hidden ones on trying to prove that climate change is not as serious as it is? Would you then take funding from there or should you not? So these are kind of questions that if you were to focus on the concept itself, might require or generate certain obligations and perhaps a more concrete way in which a more unpacking of these concepts might be helpful to even make research more ethical. So what does integrity in research require from researchers, funders, even?
Thank you for the insights, Dr. Wu. Would Dr. Dickler like to add anything else to this?
Just a couple of comments and thoughts, I think. So I think these international agreements are critically important. One of the things we really need to understand is to what extent is the health voice in these international agreements like the Paris Climate Change Accord and those sort of activities. And I think doing research around climate change and health and the impact of some of these instruments on that is actually a really important piece of work. Is the health voice in these types of international instruments loud enough? And what's the ethics of the health voice not being included? What is that? But also, I think we heard about the UNESCO declaration. What we are at the moment at our unit really looking at the values that are in some of these, doing research on the values in some of these documents to understand what are the values and principles that are being espoused and what are the ones that should be and how are they affecting different populations. So we know that solidarity is increasingly a value used in these types of discussions, global health justice, sustainability, and obviously all the intergenerational. But what does that actually mean? So a really interesting question, I think, for essay writers is, what should one of these values of solidarity and one of these instruments look like in the Malaysian context, or what does it currently look like, or what it ought to look like? So I think that's a really interesting question that people could sort of mull over or think about in their essay.
All right, thank you, Dr. Littler. So here comes our last question. Is it an ethical matter that a responsible body be set up to ensure that research into health and climate change comply with ethics?
So I think there's two levels to this question. There's the meta level. There's the big question about, could you have a body that thinks of just about how all research is done on climate and health change? And that's a really interesting question because there's no body that has responsibility for all research. But I think what was raised by Tech Chuan earlier in relation to priority setting and to make sure research is ethical, part of the question that needs to be asked, I think, whether you're a Ministry of Health, whether you're a researcher in a university, or whether you're a research funder, for example, is how are you setting your priorities for doing climate change and health research? So that's an ethical question. I think there's an obligation to include that in your thinking, to make the research that you're doing ethical and not wasteful. So there's sort of one level question. But then I think you cannot, if you're thinking about this type of research, not think about the role of national or institutional research ethics committees, who are the main body for thinking about the ethical issues. But they're not the only body. And I think it's really important that we think about the inclusion of ethics as kind of a bit more holistic and not just at one point in time with the research ethics committee, but they have a huge role to play in this. And as I said before, I think the way that a research ethics committee and the way we think about social benefit needs to change. But I think the role of research ethics committees for reviewing proposals that involve human participants, unless there's grounds for exemption, can function at a variety of levels, including institutional, local, regional, national, and even at international levels. Because, for example, WHO itself has a research ethics committee that should be looking at these types of proposals. The process of ethical review has been criticised, I think, by some for being sometimes a bit slow or bureaucratic. But actually, I think it has an important role to play in ensuring that the research in this space is done ethically. And we can look back to COVID-19 for the widespread adaptations of ethical review mechanisms. So among the lessons learned from during COVID include the need for rapid collaboration across sectors, a focus and support for the highest priority research. I've already mentioned that. The requirement to urgently adopt rigorous and innovative trial designs, and the importance of the rapid sharing of reliable information. And I think these all need to be included in our response to how we do research in climate change and health. And research ethics committees should increasingly be looking at these factors and considering climate change and health as an emergency, so adapting their processes. So yeah, I think there's an ethical imperative for us as a community to think about and prepare our guidance for ethics committees, but beyond that, our guidance for researchers, for ministries of health, and adapt our systems and our protocols to reflect the urgency that I think needs to be attached to the way that we do climate and health research. And I think we need to support research ethics committees on taking on board some of this mission, but not all of this mission. And I'll stop there. And I am sure Tech Chuan will have something to add.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very big question. It's a question of how ethics is really embedded, right? And from whom and through which process and which body. If you really think about it, research is really just about plugging in gaps in knowledge, right? So as to guide our health policy, our health system, for example. And so there are always all these committees, research ethics committees, that's like trying to make sure that research is ethical. But there are also other processes that would make the process ethical, right? So just to give you an example, let's say you are trying to suggest certain interventions in the health system and you do some research on it, and you say that, okay, there should be some uptake on this to reduce waste, for example. But what if that waste reduction method that you have researched on actually conflicts with patient safety, right? And you wouldn't know this if you don't engage with the people who are actually on the ground day-to-day, nurses, for example, who knows that if you do this, for example, if you change this particular thing, even though it may save cost, reduce carbon emission, water reuse, for example, it actually makes the whole practice a lot unsafe. So research ethics committees, but also the community itself might be a useful resource for guiding research. So one way that people do is to set up community advisory boards, or to actually just do stakeholder engagement with the relevant people to understand what sort of research questions should they actually be thinking about. And when you have that kind of processes, it's actually easier to bridge research and practice. So that when you actually try to roll out that and implement that research, there actually will be uptake and buy-in, right? As opposed to doing something that's like totally in silos and not connected to practice itself and with the relevant stakeholders. The other thing I want to add is that maybe in terms of the question you guys are thinking about is the kind of training that committees and bodies necessarily need in order to fulfill the role that Catherine just mentioned. So I sit on some ethics committees, but you ask me to reevaluate the environmental sustainability of research, I wouldn't be able to do that. I don't have the training. I don't know the standards they should abide by. If someone just tells me that, okay, they comply with this standard, I will just have to accept that they say yes, right? So what sort of training, whether it's science, ethics, and so forth, do the relevant bodies need to have in order to fulfill the obligations to evaluate research properly?
Can I just add something, which I think is a really important point that Tech Chuan's raised, and that is not only what research ethics committees need, but also what kind of training do researchers need to think about the environmental impacts of what they're doing. So I think we do need to do some rethinking of our training of researchers, research ethics committees, funders, people within ministries of health, but also to really adapt and think about the environmental impacts. But I also think there really needs to be conversations between different disciplines. So for me, what's really interesting to see is obviously the whole debate on climate change really started in the environmental sector, and now health is sort of coming into the discussions. But the way that health thinks about risk benefit is very different to the way that the environmental community thinks about issues like risk benefit. So I think these discussions between different communities, even in the research sector, really need to be happening now. And how we train and teach needs to be rethought to include some of these environmental issues. And we can't expect all people on a research ethics committee to be specialists. So how do we bring that knowledge in? Do we have a subset who are environmental scientists, for example, who comment on proposals and the environmental factor? I don't know. It's really interesting because I do think it's the right time to be having these discussions and rethinking.
So thank you, Dr. Victor and Dr. Wu. So I believe that we have no other question on this topic. So once again, thank you so much, Dr. Wu and Dr. Victor, for the very comprehensive clarification. And it has definitely cleared the uncertainties we had in our minds. And we truly appreciate the time that you have spent with us today. And now we are in a better position to approach the essay competition topic. So thank you so much.